They called him the man with 3 legs, not as a cruel joke, but as a simple, undeniable fact. In the photograph before you, taken more than a century ago, you see a man sitting with perfect poise, his hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate, and then your eyes travel down. And there it is, a 3rd leg, fully formed, complete with its own foot. It's the kind of image that makes your mind stop for a moment. You blink, thinking maybe it's some trick of the light, a photographer's prank from the early 1900s. But no, this is no illusion. What you're looking at is very, very real. This man's name was Francesco Lentini, and his life was anything but ordinary. Born in a time when difference was often met with fear, ridicule, or worse, Francesco entered the world carrying a secret written into his very body. But what makes his story so gripping is not just the medical marvel of his condition. It's what he did with it. He didn't hide. He didn't shrink into the shadows. Instead, he stepped forward into the spotlight and turned what many would have considered a curse into his greatest strength. But before he could do that, there were years of struggle, years of whispers behind closed doors, of curious stares in crowded streets, of a boy trying to understand why he wasn't like the others. Imagine it, Sicily, 1889. A small village surrounded by rolling hills and the endless blue of the Mediterranean. A place where everyone knew everyone else's name and everyone else's business. When Francesco was born, word of his unusual body spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors, relatives, even strangers came to see the child with 3 legs, as if he were some kind of spectacle. The truth was more complex and more tragic. Francesco wasn't just born with 3 legs. He had, quite literally, the remnants of a twin brother fused to his body. Medical science today calls it a case of a parasitic twin, an incomplete second body that developed alongside his own but never fully formed. His extra leg extended from his right hip, slightly shorter than the other 2, but functional enough that he could move it at will. Along with it came a tiny, malformed 4th foot, and even, according to historical accounts, a small extra set of toes. To the medical world of the late 19th century, this was an oddity worth documenting. To the people of his village, it was something between a miracle and a curse. To Francesco's family, it was simply their son. But growing up like this in the 1890s wasn't easy. There were no campaigns for body positivity, no viral social media posts celebrating uniqueness. If you were different, you were often shunned, stared at, or exploited. Francesco quickly learned to read people's eyes. The ones that looked at him with pity, the ones that looked at him with disgust, and the ones that looked at him with curiosity that bordered on obsession. And here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Francesco didn't let that destroy him. He learned to laugh at the questions, to make light of the gasps, to own the very thing that set him apart. It was as if, from an early age, he understood something that would take most of us a lifetime to realize. That the parts of ourselves we're taught to hide might just be the source of our greatest power. By his teenage years, Francesco had made a decision. If the world was going to stare at him, then he was going to give them something worth staring at. This choice would lead him away from Sicily, across the ocean to America, and eventually onto the grand stages of the early 20th century, where he would astonish crowds not just with his body, but with his charm, his athletic skill, and his razor-sharp wit. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the fame, before the applause, before the world came to know his name, there was a boy in a small Sicilian village, staring out at the horizon and wondering if there was a place in the world for someone like him. And somewhere deep inside, Francesco Lentini must have felt the answer, yes. But I'm going to have to fight for it. What he couldn't have known then was that his journey, from a tiny village in Italy to the spotlight of the biggest shows in America, would not only change his own life, but leave behind a story still capable of captivating us more than 100 years later. A story that begins right here, with this photograph, and a man who refused to be defined by what made him different. Francesco's earliest memories weren't of playing in the streets or climbing the olive trees outside his family's home. They were of people staring. It wasn't the kind of quick glance we give a stranger passing by. It was the long, fixed look of someone who doesn't even realize they're being rude. People would lean forward ever so slightly, their eyes darting to the right side of his body, to that extra leg hanging there like an unanswered question. When he was very small, Francesco didn't understand why. He thought maybe other children also had a little leg, as he called it. He remembers tugging at his mother's skirt one day and asking her, "Where's Antonio's third leg?" The look on her face told him more than her words ever could. His parents, devout and hardworking, loved him fiercely, but they lived in a time and place where such a birth was seen by many as a bad omen, even a punishment from God. Some neighbors whispered that his mother must have sinned, others claimed it was witchcraft. The village priest, caught between superstition and scripture, baptized the child quickly, as if holy water could wash away what nature had given him. Inside his home, Francesco was safe. His mother taught him to read by candlelight. His father encouraged him to walk, run, and climb just like any other boy. And Francesco could do all of it, perhaps even better than the others. He had learned early to use his third leg for balance, for tricks, even for playful kicks that sent the neighborhood boys running in mock terror. But the world outside those walls was less kind. At school, the children were curious at first. They'd crowd around him, begging to see the miracle leg. But curiosity soon turned to cruelty. "Three-leg," they'd chant, following him home. Some tried to trip him, thinking it was funny. Others asked if he was part animal or if the extra leg would grow into another person. Francesco's way of surviving this wasn't to fight back, not physically at least. He learned to outwit them, to turn the insult into a joke before it could wound him. "Of course I have 3 legs," he'd say. "I'm faster than all of you." And when he proved it in a race, their laughter turned into cheers, even if only for a moment. By the time he was a teenager, Francesco had developed something rare, an unshakable sense of self-awareness. He knew exactly how the world saw him, and instead of resenting it, he began to craft it into a kind of performance. If they were going to stare, then he would make them remember why. But there was another reality pressing in on his young life: poverty. Sicily in the late 19th century was a place of breathtaking beauty, but also deep hardship. Jobs were scarce, opportunities even scarcer. Many families dreamed of America, the land where fortunes could be made, where difference might not be a curse but a ticket to something bigger. For Francesco, the decision came slowly. At first, the idea of leaving his home was unthinkable. He loved his family, his village, the smell of the sea on warm evenings. But he also knew he didn't want to spend his life being just the boy with 3 legs to a handful of people in a small town. One day, a traveling performer came through the village, a man who worked in a small circus, showing oddities from around the world. He had heard rumors about Francesco and asked to see him. They met in a cafe, and after a few minutes of conversation, the man leaned in and said, "You could be famous." The words hit Francesco like a spark. He wasn't thinking of fame for vanity's sake. He was thinking of freedom, of a life where his difference could feed him, clothe him, maybe even send money back home. Not long after, with his parents' blessing, he left Sicily. His journey would take him first to Naples, then across the Atlantic on a crowded ship filled with immigrants chasing their own dreams. And from there, into the roaring lights of a world he could hardly have imagined. But even then, on that ship, Francesco had no idea just how far his story would go. Because in America, he wouldn't just be seen, he would be celebrated. The night before Francesco left Sicily, he didn't sleep. He lay awake on a narrow bed, staring at the wooden beams above him. The air was thick with the scent of olive oil and wood smoke from the kitchen, a smell he had known since birth. Outside, The village was quiet, the kind of silence only a rural town could hold, broken only by the distant barking of dogs and the gentle hum of waves against the shore. His mother had given him a small cloth pouch. Inside was a silver coin, worn smooth from years of handling, and a lock of her hair tied with red thread. "So you'll never forget where you come from," she whispered. The next morning, he walked to the port with his father. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The silence between them was heavy with the unspoken. At the dock, his father placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, and said, "Be strong, Francesco. Show them you are more than what they see." The ship to Naples was crowded, loud, and smelled of salt and sweat. Families clung to one another, clutching small bundles of belongings. Some were leaving for good, others only for work. Francesco was among the few traveling alone. From Naples, he boarded a much larger vessel bound for America. The journey across the Atlantic would take nearly 2 weeks. The sea was unpredictable, some days calm as glass, others roaring with storms that made the ship groan and the passengers pray. Below deck, the air was damp and close, a mingling of bodies and fear. But Francesco found something unexpected there: anonymity. In the cramped quarters, surrounded by hundreds of strangers, his 3 legs were not the only thing unusual. There were men with missing arms, women with faces weathered like stone, children with eyes far too old for their years. In that floating microcosm, everyone carried their own scars. At night, he would slip to the upper deck and look out at the black expanse of water, broken only by the faint silver of moonlight. He imagined the shores of America rising up to meet him, the streets he'd heard about in whispered stories, streets paved with opportunity, where no one knew his name, where he could decide for himself what he would be. When the ship finally approached New York Harbor, the sight was like something from a dream. The Statue of Liberty stood tall against the morning sky, her torch catching the first light of day. People crowded the rails, pointing, crying, some even dropping to their knees in prayer. Francesco felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was it, the new world. But it wasn't a fairy tale. He still had to pass through Ellis Island, where inspectors would decide who stayed and who was sent back. When his turn came, the officials' eyes lingered a fraction too long on his right side. Francesco held his breath. Would they see him as a worker or as a burden, a man or a curiosity? The inspector finally stamped his papers. Next, relief flooded through him. He stepped out into the cold air of New York City for the first time, the sound of the city swelling around him, the clang of trolley bells, the shouts of street vendors, the rumble of carriages. It was overwhelming, chaotic, and intoxicating. He spent his first nights in a boarding house for Italian immigrants, sharing a room with 3 other men. Work was scarce, and Francesco knew that without a trade or connections, his chances were slim. That's when he remembered the circus man's words: "You could be famous." The path to that fame began in a small theater in Brooklyn, where traveling sideshows would set up between bigger acts. Francesco approached the manager, a stocky man with a cigar permanently lodged between his teeth, and asked for a chance. The manager looked him up and down, his eyes narrowing. "Kid, you're either a liar or you're the real deal. Show me." Francesco did. Within minutes, the man was grinning. "All right, 3-leg, you've got yourself a spot. Let's see if the crowds love you as much as I think they will." And just like that, Francesco stepped into a world of bright lights, gasps, and applause. But what he didn't yet realize was that this world, the one he was about to enter, could make you a star just as easily as it could devour you whole. The first night Francesco performed, the theater smelled of popcorn, tobacco, and something faintly metallic from the old stage lights. The crowd was restless, a blur of hats, scarves, and expectant faces. They had come to see wonders, oddities, and perhaps something to make them whisper on the way home. When the curtain rose, Francesco stood center stage, wearing a dark suit tailored to his unusual form. For a moment, the room went silent. Then came the murmurs, the gasps, the incredulous laughter. But Francesco didn't flinch. He stepped forward, tipped his hat, and with the poise of a gentleman, began to speak. His voice carried across the theater, warm, steady, and tinged with an Italian accent. He told them about his childhood, his journey across the ocean, not as a sob story, but as an adventure. And when he revealed his third leg, there was no cruelty in his eyes, only a quiet confidence. That night, he wasn't just a curiosity. He was a storyteller. Word spread quickly. The three-legged man became a name that traveled through the streets of New York, whispered in bars, printed in papers. Soon, sideshow owners from across the country wanted him. The offers came with promises of steady pay, travel, and the kind of fame most immigrants could only dream about. But fame in the world of sideshows came with a cost. Behind the scenes, performers like Francesco were often treated as property. Contracts were vague, managers were ruthless, and the line between admiration and exploitation blurred quickly. In his early days on the road, he traveled with a small troupe, a bearded lady named Josephine, a man billed as the human skeleton, and a fire eater who could swallow flames as casually as another man might sip wine. They became his family, bound together not just by the work, but by the shared understanding that the world saw them as other. Crowds adored Francesco. Children stared wide-eyed. Adults leaned forward in their seats, desperate to catch every detail. But as the applause washed over him, he began to feel something gnawing at the edges of his pride. Was he really being celebrated or just displayed? The answer wasn't simple. Each time he stepped off the stage, there were men who wanted to touch his leg as if it were a talisman, women who giggled nervously and asked invasive questions. Newspapers printed sensational headlines, sometimes inventing details about his life to make the story juicier. And yet, the money was real. He was sending funds back to his family in Sicily, ensuring his parents lived comfortably. He was wearing fine suits, eating in restaurants where, months earlier, he wouldn't have been allowed past the door. By 1903, Francesco was a featured act in some of the largest traveling shows in America. He saw more of the country than most men of his time. The dusty streets of Texas towns, the glittering lights of Chicago, the frozen sidewalks of Boston. Every city brought new audiences, new admirers, and new challenges. But with each passing year, the show business machine grew hungrier. Managers wanted bigger acts, stranger spectacles. Performers were pushed to exaggerate their stories, to invent tragedies or miracles that would keep ticket sales high. Francesco was pressured to play up the idea that his condition was the result of some mysterious accident, a curse, or a miracle of nature. He resisted at first, clinging to the truth. But the truth didn't always sell as well as the myth. One evening, after a show in St. Louis, Josephine found him sitting alone in the performer's tent, staring at the floor. "You're thinking too much again," she said with a smile. "Maybe," he replied, "but sometimes I wonder if they see me at all, or just the leg." She didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, "We all wonder that, Francesco. But maybe the trick is to make them see both." Her words stayed with him. If he was going to live in the spotlight, he would do it on his terms. Not just as a man with three legs, but as a man with a story worth hearing. What Francesco didn't know then was that his story was only just beginning. In the years to come, he would become more than a sideshow act. He would become a symbol of resilience, of survival, and of the strange, complicated beauty of being different. By 1905, Francesco Lentini was no longer just a performer. He was a sensation. His image appeared in posters plastered on brick walls, his name painted in bold colors on the sides of circus wagons. In small towns, people would line the streets hours before the show, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man they had read about in the papers. The three-legged wonder, they called him. And yet, with every cheer, with every burst of applause, Francesco began to feel the weight of what it meant to live inside a story the world had written for him. The money was good, better than any factory job could offer. He could afford fine meals, good clothes, even send gifts back home to Sicily. But each night, as the crowd roared, he felt a strange emptiness creeping in, because for all the fascination he inspired, few saw him as a man first. To them, he was a spectacle, something to point at, to gossip about. The managers didn't help. They pushed him to tell wilder stories, to pose in exaggerated ways that emphasized his difference. They wanted him to lean into the strangeness, to make it unforgettable. It was in Chicago that the real conflict began. One night, after a particularly long performance, his manager approached him with a new idea. "We'll dress you as a Roman gladiator," the man said, grinning. "We'll say you're the reincarnation of some ancient warrior who returned with 3 legs as a sign of divine favor. We'll charge extra for photos." Francesco stared at him. "That's not my story," he said flatly. "Your story," the manager replied, "is whatever fills the seats." Those words stuck in his mind like a thorn. That night, lying in his small hotel bed, he thought about the boy he once was, the boy in Sicily who had learned to run faster than anyone expected, who had dreamed of being more than a curiosity. Had he traded that dream for applause that wasn't truly his? Still, there were moments of real connection. After one show, a father approached him, his young son hiding shyly behind his leg. The boy had a visible deformity in his foot. The father's eyes were wet as he shook Francesco's hand. "My son didn't want to come," he admitted. "He's ashamed. But after seeing you tonight, I think he believes he can do anything." Francesco bent down to meet the boy's eyes. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly. It was in moments like these that Francesco realized the stage could be more than a cage. It could be a platform. If people came to see him out of curiosity, maybe he could send them away with something deeper. And so, he began to change his act. He still showed his 3rd leg. It was, after all, what brought people in. But now, between the laughs and gasps, he spoke about acceptance, about using what made you different as a strength. He told stories not just of his own life, but of others he'd met in the sideshow. People who had turned the world's cruelty into resilience. At first, the managers resisted. "You're getting too serious," one complained. "They come for the freak show, not a lecture." But audiences responded. His shows began to sell out not just because people wanted to see something strange, but because they left feeling something unexpected: admiration. It was a dangerous line to walk. Too much sincerity, and he risked losing the spectacle that paid the bills. Too much spectacle, and he risked losing himself. By 1908, Francesco was traveling with one of the largest circuses in the country. He had his own carriage, his own tailor, and more money than he had ever imagined. Yet, in quiet moments, he still thought about that question Josephine had posed years earlier. Do they see me, or just the leg? The answer, he realized, might always be both. But perhaps that wasn't a tragedy. Perhaps the trick was to make sure that what they saw first wasn't the only thing they remembered. And so, night after night, city after city, Francesco stepped into the spotlight, not just as the 3-legged man, but as a man determined to show the world that every life, no matter how unusual, could hold extraordinary beauty. By the summer of 1910, Francesco Lentini had built something rare in the world of traveling shows: respect. His act was no longer a novelty that people laughed at and forgot. It was a story that stayed with them. He had turned his difference into a message, and for years, the audiences had rewarded him with loyalty. But in show business, success breeds envy. It began with whispers among the other performers. Someone was spreading rumors, claiming that Francesco's inspiring speeches were fake, that he was just another con man milking sympathy for profit. At first, he ignored it. Circus life was full of petty rivalries. But then the rumors began appearing in the press. One morning, in a small-town diner before a show, Francesco unfolded a newspaper and froze. The headline read, "Is the three-legged man a three-faced fraud?" The article claimed that Francesco's third leg was a clever prosthetic, that he had fooled the public for years, and that the real reason he traveled so much was to avoid exposure. It was a complete fabrication. But in an era without quick fact-checking, a lie printed in ink could travel faster than the truth. The damage was immediate. In several towns, ticket sales dropped. Some audiences still came, but they were colder, watching with narrowed eyes. His once warm receptions turned into guarded, skeptical applause. Behind the scenes, Francesco began an investigation. It didn't take long to find the source. A rival performer in the same show, a knife thrower named Samuel Silverhand Grady. Grady had always resented the attention Francesco received, claiming that real skill should earn more admiration than a quirk of nature. When confronted, Grady didn't deny it. He simply smirked and said, "You've been hogging the spotlight too long, Lentini. Time someone knocked you down." Francesco could have gone to management, but he knew how the business worked. Managers didn't care about truth, they cared about what sold tickets. If a scandal drew more curious spectators, they would let it play out. And so, Francesco made a choice. He would answer the accusations not with arguments, but with proof. At his next show, he changed the format entirely. No more shadows, no more staged reveals. Instead, he stepped into the center of the ring under full light, removed his trousers just above the knee, and stood before the crowd in fitted shorts. Gasps echoed through the tent. The third leg was undeniably real, its foot flexing naturally, toes curling and uncurling in a way no prosthetic could mimic. Then, without a word, Francesco walked, ran, and even kicked a ball with his extra limb, letting the crowd see every movement. There was no trick, no illusion, just the truth, plain and undeniable. The audience erupted into applause. Not the polite clapping of curiosity, but the loud, sustained roar of people who had just witnessed a man defend his honor with nothing but reality. The very next day, the same newspaper printed a retraction. It was buried on page 6, but the damage began to heal. And in a strange twist, the controversy actually boosted his fame. People came not only to see the man with 3 legs, but the man who had stood up to lies and won. Grady, on the other hand, found his own bookings drying up. In the close-knit world of performers, his betrayal was unforgivable. Within a year, he was gone from the circuit entirely. For Francesco, the episode was a painful reminder. Fame could vanish overnight, not because of failure, but because of envy. He learned to guard not only his act, but his story. Still, the betrayal had left its mark. Late at night, after the applause faded and the tent stood empty, he would sit in his carriage and wonder how many people still saw him as the man he wanted to be, and how many still saw just the oddity. But perhaps that was the price of the spotlight. And Francesco Lentini had decided long ago that the price, no matter how steep, was worth paying, as long as he could control the ending of his story. It was in the spring of 1912, in a small town in Pennsylvania, when Francesco Lentini first saw her. Her name was Teresa Murray, a schoolteacher with dark hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and eyes that seemed to see straight through the noise of the circus. Francesco noticed her not because she clapped louder than the others. In fact, she didn't clap much at all, but because she listened differently. While the crowd laughed and gasped, she simply watched, her expression calm, curious, and unshaken by the spectacle. After the show, as the other performers packed up, Francesco found her waiting by the exit. She didn't ask for an autograph or a photograph like most visitors. Instead, she said, "You speak well for a man whose job is to be stared at. Doesn't that ever tire you?" Her bluntness caught him off guard. Most people approached him with pity or exaggerated admiration. But Teresa's tone was different, level, even challenging. That night, they shared coffee at a small diner across from the railway station. For hours, they talked about everything except his third leg. She asked about his childhood in Sicily, his first winter in America, his favorite books. She spoke about her students, her love for poetry, her frustrations with a world that valued appearances over depth. By the time they finished, the streets outside were empty and the diner owner was wiping down the last tables. For Francesco, the encounter was unsettling. He was used to admiration, curiosity, and sometimes revulsion, but Teresa's quiet, steady interest felt entirely new. Over the following months, their paths crossed again and again. Whenever the circus came near her town, she would attend, always alone, always slipping backstage afterward with a smile and a question about something other than the performance. And slowly, Francesco began to let her into the parts of his life he had kept off stage. He told her about the loneliness that had followed him across the ocean, the nights when he felt like a walking exhibit rather than a man. He confessed the sting of betrayal from Grady's false accusations. She listened without flinching, never turning the conversation into sympathy or spectacle. One rainy evening, as they sat beneath a striped awning watching people hurry past with umbrellas, Teresa said something that Francesco would never forget. "You think the world comes to see you because of what you are," she said softly. "But the ones who truly stay, they stay because of who you are." The words struck him like a bell. For so long, he had defined himself by the way others reacted to his body. But here was someone telling him that his value had nothing to do with his difference and everything to do with his character. Their relationship deepened, though it was not without challenges. The life of a traveling performer was demanding, unpredictable. Weeks would pass without a letter, months without seeing each other. Gossip followed him everywhere, and more than once Teresa heard cruel remarks from those who couldn't imagine why a woman would choose a man like that. But she stayed. In 1914, in a quiet ceremony attended by a handful of friends, Francesco Lentini married Teresa Murray. There were no circus tents, no flashing lights. Just a small church, the smell of fresh lilies, and vows spoken with the unshakable certainty of two people who had already faced the world's judgment and found it irrelevant. For the first time in his life, Francesco felt what it was to be seen not as a curiosity, not as a performer, but simply as a man. And yet, even in happiness, he knew that the road ahead would test them in ways neither could yet imagine. Fame was fickle, crowds were unpredictable, and the world, though fascinated by difference, could be unforgiving toward those who refused to be defined by it. Still, as he looked at Teresa that day, her hand resting lightly in his, Francesco made a silent vow of his own. No matter how the years changed them, he would protect the truth of who they were to each other, even if the rest of the world never understood. In the years after their wedding, Francesco and Teresa enjoyed a fragile but real sense of stability. The circus routes were familiar, the audiences still loyal, and their small rented apartment in Buffalo felt like a permanent home for the first time in Francesco's life. But in 1920, a shift began to ripple through the entertainment world, a shift that would threaten everything they had built. Moving pictures were no longer a novelty. Nickelodeons had turned into lavish movie palaces, and crowds who once paid to see the wonders of the circus now paid to watch flickering reels of silent films. The change was slow at first. Attendance at the side shows dipped slightly, then more sharply. Weeks that once guaranteed packed tents now ended with rows of empty benches. And for the first time in years, Francesco saw the ringmaster pacing backstage, muttering about ticket sales. The circus adapted by cutting acts, reducing salaries, and shortening tours. Performers who had been with the show for decades were suddenly gone. Some took jobs in factories. Others disappeared entirely. For Francesco, the danger was not just financial. His career was built on being seen, on turning his difference into a story the public couldn't forget. But if the public stopped coming, what then? Teresa noticed the tension in his jaw, the way he stayed awake at night staring at the ceiling. "We've been through worse," she reminded him. "We'll find a way through this too." But Francesco knew the stakes were higher now. He was no longer the lone young man chasing opportunity across America. He had a wife, and by 1921, a young son named James. The thought of failing them gnawed at him more than any personal loss ever could. In the spring of 1922, the Lentinis faced their first true financial crisis. The circus cut their pay in half and offered fewer performance dates. Between the reduced income and the rising cost of living, their savings evaporated in months. That summer, Francesco made the difficult decision to leave the circus for the first time in his career. It was a gamble. Stepping away from the world he knew best into something uncertain. But the alternative was staying aboard a sinking ship. Through a friend in New York, he secured short-term work performing at a vaudeville theater. The pay was modest, but the audiences were different, more intimate, less chaotic, and surprisingly receptive to his act. He added more speaking to his performance, weaving stories about his life between physical demonstrations. And in that adjustment, something unexpected happened. Francesco discovered that people were not just interested in seeing him, they wanted to hear him. Word spread quickly. Soon he was invited to perform at universities, civic clubs, and charity events. The audiences were smaller than the circus crowds, but they listened with an intensity he had rarely experienced. It was during one of these talks at a YMCA hall in Philadelphia that Francesco realized his career could evolve. That he didn't have to be chained to the idea of spectacle. He could use his platform to speak about perseverance, about self-worth, about refusing to let the world dictate the limits of your life. Teresa was his constant supporter, managing correspondence, handling bookings, and gently reminding him to rest when his schedule grew too heavy. But even as things stabilized, Francesco understood that the entertainment landscape would keep changing. For now, the lights had dimmed but not gone out. The challenge ahead was to keep them burning, not just for his career, but for the family who depended on him. By the mid-1920s, Francesco Lentini had done something few sideshow performers could claim. He had successfully transitioned from a spectacle act to a storyteller, from a man displayed to be seen to a man invited to be heard. But with that change came a new sense of responsibility. The invitations to speak were no longer just from theaters and private clubs. Schools began reaching out. Community organizations asked him to address youth gatherings. And each time he stood before a group of young faces, he remembered his own childhood. The shame, the isolation, the whispered cruelty of other children. It was at a high school auditorium in Rochester that the idea truly took root. After his talk, a boy of about 15 lingered in the corner of the stage. When the crowd had left, he approached, hands buried in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. I'm different too," the boy muttered. He explained, haltingly, that he had been born with a clubfoot. Kids laughed. Some teachers looked away. Francesco bent down, making sure his gaze met the boy's. "They don't get to decide who you are," he said. "Only you do." The boy's eyes lifted just slightly, enough for Francesco to see a flicker of something he recognized, the fragile spark of hope. That night, Francesco told Teresa he wanted to do more than just entertain. "I have a voice now," he said. "If all I do is tell people about my life, then I'm wasting it. I need to tell them what it means." And so began a new chapter. His talks became less about the mechanics of living with 3 legs and more about resilience, self-worth, and the courage to defy the expectations of others. He didn't sugarcoat his past, the taunts, the loneliness, the frustration, but he always framed them as battles worth fighting. By 1926, he was speaking to packed halls again, not because of novelty, but because of the way he made people feel. Letters poured in from parents, teachers, and even fellow performers, thanking him for his candor and for showing that a life marked by difference could still be full of dignity and joy. One of his most memorable speeches came at a veterans' hospital in New Jersey. Many of the men there had lost limbs in World War I. Francesco walked into the ward, not with pity, but with camaraderie. "You and I," he told them, "we're part of a brotherhood. We know what it's like to have the world stare and still find a way to keep moving." The room, silent at first, erupted in applause. For these men, his words weren't theoretical, they were proof. Proof that life could still hold meaning, even beauty, after loss. But not everyone approved of this transformation. Some in the sideshow world felt he was turning his back on the very industry that had made him. "You think you're better than us now?" one old colleague sneered after a performance. Francesco's answer was calm, but firm. "No, I just know that my story can be more than a ticket stub." Teresa supported him through it all, even as the travel became exhausting. Their son James was growing fast, and Francesco was determined to be more present than his own father had been. Still, the pull of the road was strong. There were days when he doubted himself, wondering if this mission of his could truly make a difference. But each time he saw a shy student stand a little taller after hearing him speak, or a wounded veteran smile for the first time in months, he knew the answer. His fame had given him a platform. Now, it was giving him purpose. By the early 1940s, Francesco Lentini was no longer just a name known to circus posters and sideshow marquees. He had become a figure of quiet inspiration in towns and cities across America. His schedule was slower now, his steps measured, but the audiences still came. They came for the warmth in his voice, the humor in his stories, and the way he made them see themselves in him, no matter how different their lives had been. Then came the telegram. It was a short, clipped message, the kind that never brings good news. His younger brother, still living in Italy, had fallen gravely ill. The Atlantic was a world at war, and travel was dangerous, almost impossible. For the first time in decades, Francesco felt the crushing weight of distance and helplessness. He tried to write daily, sending long letters filled with encouragement, stories from the road, and memories of their boyhood in Sicily. But as weeks turned into months, the replies grew fewer, then stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Francesco had spent a lifetime telling others how to face hardship with courage. Now, he had to live by his own words. But grief has a way of slipping through even the strongest armor. His performances remained lively, but in the quiet moments backstage, he sat alone, staring at the floor, his third leg folded as still as the others. Teresa noticed the change. "You don't have to keep going," she told him one evening. "No one would blame you for resting now." But Francesco shook his head. "If I stop, I'll lose the only thing that keeps me moving." And so he carried on. In those years, the country was gripped by the uncertainty of World War II. His talks took on new weight. He spoke to communities where fathers and sons had gone off to fight, to mothers who dreaded every knock on the door. He didn't lecture them about bravery. He showed it, simply by standing there. A man who had been born different, had been told he would never fit in, and yet had made a life worth living. One evening in Pennsylvania, after a performance at a small town hall, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. Her husband had lost both legs in combat and refused to leave their home. "Would you speak to him?" she asked. Francesco agreed without hesitation. The visit was quiet, no speeches, no stage lights, just a man with 3 legs sitting beside a man with none, talking about life, about how the world measures worth in all the wrong ways. That visit, Teresa later learned, had convinced the soldier to go outside for the first time in months. It was moments like that which convinced Francesco he was exactly where he needed to be, even as his body began to show its limits. He moved slower, the long tours replaced by shorter circuits, but his voice, warm, confident, and tinged with humor, remained as strong as ever. By the mid-1940s, He knew his career was nearing its end, but he wanted to leave the stage on his own terms, not because illness forced him. So he planned one final tour. A farewell not to fame, but to the thousands of strangers who had let him into their hearts. He ended his last public appearance in Jacksonville with the words, "I was born with 3 legs, and people thought that made me less. I learned it made me more. And so I say to you, whatever it is that makes you different, it may be the very thing that makes you extraordinary." The audience rose to its feet, the applause rolling like thunder. For Francesco, it wasn't just the end of a show. It was the closing of a chapter that had taken him from a frightened boy in Sicily to an unlikely voice of courage in America. The years after Francesco's final tour passed quietly. He and Teresa settled in Jacksonville, where the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and orange blossoms. No more frantic schedules, no more long train rides, just mornings spent reading the paper, afternoons walking the neighborhood, and evenings filled with the sound of the radio. Still, even in retirement, Francesco never truly stopped telling his story. Children from the neighborhood would gather on his porch, staring wide-eyed at the man with 3 legs as he told them tales of faraway cities, of circus tents that smelled of sawdust and laughter, and of the people he had met, strong, strange, beautiful people who had taught him that life's worth is never measured by the shape of your body. In 1966, at the age of 77, Francesco Lentini passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news spread quietly, tucked into small-town papers under headlines like, "The Three-Legged Man Dies at 77. But for those who had met him, the loss felt far greater than the size of any obituary. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived at Teresa's door. From former performers who remembered his kindness backstage. From soldiers and amputees who had drawn strength from his words. From parents whose children had been born different, thanking Francesco for showing them that difference was not a curse, but a story waiting to be told. Teresa kept them all, tied together with a length of faded ribbon. She would sometimes read them aloud to herself, each one a reminder that her husband's legacy could never be contained to the physical oddity that had made him famous. In the decades since his passing, the world has changed. Sideshows have faded into history, replaced by movies, television, and the endless stream of digital faces. But Francesco's story, the boy from Sicily who refused to be ashamed, who turned stares into smiles, still travels. It's told in classrooms, in books, in corners of the internet where old photographs surface and spark wonder. And perhaps that is his greatest trick of all, not bending spoons or swallowing swords, but bending the way we see each other. Because when you look at that photograph of Francesco Lentini, dressed in his sharp suit, one leg crossed over the other 2, you might first see the oddity. But if you look closer, really look, you'll see a man whose life was a masterclass in turning what the world calls a flaw into a weapon of connection. He lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the slow fading of the sideshow era. He loved deeply, worked tirelessly, and found joy in places others might overlook. And he left behind not just the memory of the 3-legged man, but the living proof that identity is never just about what we are born with. It's about what we do with it. So, the next time life places something in your path that feels like an unfair burden, think of Francesco. Think of the boy who walked into a schoolyard in Sicily and decided he would never bow his head. Think of the man who stood in front of packed tents and made thousands laugh, not at him, but with him. Think of the husband, the father, the quiet neighbor in Jacksonville whose 3 legs carried him far beyond the limits others tried to place on him. And maybe ask yourself this: what is the thing in you? The thing you've been told makes you strange, makes you less, that might, in the right light, make you extraordinary? Because Francesco Lentini's life wasn't just about having 3 legs. It was about living in such a way that the number didn't matter. And that, perhaps, is the real magic.